Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another Jane Austen July video. And today I have Nick here with me.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking about Mansfield Park. So, Nick has just finished reading Mansfield Park for the first time.
We should probably say that we're going to spoil Mansfield Park.
We are. Lots of spoilers in this video, so don't watch it unless you've read Mansfield Park.
Yes, stop now.
This is your third Jane Austen?
It's my second proper Jane Austen. So I've read Lady Susan quite a long time ago. 6 years ago? 5 years ago. But I don't remember it very well. Of the 6 proper Jane Austen books, it's my second. I've read Pride and Prejudice as well.
And I have read Mansfield Park many times. I haven't read it this year, but I did reread it last year. I think I've read it 5 or 6 times, but I'm not completely certain. I did study it at university, and whenever I've studied a book, I have no idea how many times I've read it, because I know I read it lots of times when I studied it and don't know how many. But Mansfield Park is my second favourite Jane Austen book after Pride and Prejudice. I love it a lot. More, I think, than you loved it.
I did not love it. I think we should say to start with that Mansfield Park is one woman's heartwarming journey to sleep with her cousin.
In a time where it was considered acceptable to marry your cousins.
Like, I understand that it was allowed, but
yeah. And I mean, it is her cousin that she grew up with from childhood,
Who
like
they-
a sibling.
Yeah.
However, I do think it is worth pointing out that while Edmund definitely views Fanny as a sister, I don't think Fanny ever views Edmund as a brother, because of the way they're brought up and how oppressed Fanny is and her different class status. I think she always feels further from Edmund than Edmund feels from her. Basically, Mansfield Park is a novel about a girl called Fanny Price, who, rather than being raised by her own parents, is from the age of 10 raised by her aunt and uncle, and grows up with her 4 cousins, Edmund, Tom, Maria and Julia. Fanny Price is from a sort of middle class background, and her cousins and her aunt and uncle are from an aristocratic background, so she's brought up with them, but her sort of class and station difference is always preserved. And we follow what happens when 2 new people arrive in the neighbourhood, the Crawfords, who are a bit different and call into question everything that has been going on, and sort of disrupt the life at Mansfield Park a lot. Fanny Price has a long-standing, unrequited love for her cousin Edmund, and the book kind of follows what happens with that as well. I love Mansfield Park. You didn't like it as much as Pride and Prejudice.
I didn't like it as much as Pride and Prejudice. I think I enjoyed it. I thought it was quite interesting, but I think there's bits of the story that don't quite work for me. I think there's brilliant characters in a plot that I'm not sure entirely hangs together.
Because I think the plot definitely hangs together, but I think I would definitely say that I think Pride and Prejudice is a more perfect novel than Mansfield Park, but I think Mansfield Park is in some ways the most interesting Jane Austen novel. Like, I don't think the love story in Mansfield Park is that satisfying. I think it's very interesting, but I also see that it can be less satisfying, that Fanny Price doesn't have the same kind of character development that most of Jane Austen's other heroines have, because she's sort of built already from the beginning. So I think Mansfield Park is one of those Jane Austen books that a lot of people don't like. It's a lot of people's least favourite Jane Austen book. And the first time I read it, I didn't love it. But the more I read it and the more I think about it, the more I love it and the more I find it fascinating. And I think like the themes are sort of morality and propriety, and also Fanny Price as a character who is so introverted and so like passive and so much an observer. To write a novel that focuses on that character is really, really interesting. And I like that so often her observations are proved correct, even though there's sort of nothing she can do for a lot of the time in the book. She also is the one who sort of understands people more than everyone else around her, who is more extroverted.
I think it's got some really interesting themes, and I agree that it's a really interesting book. And I think I found it, in one respect, more interesting in terms of what I already know about the 18th and early 19th century, because we do actually get a glimpse of some people like in the middle classes, which in Pride and Prejudice they're very, very much on the periphery, whereas I think in this one it's brought to the fore a bit more. I think Jane Austen definitely set herself a challenge with Fanny Price as the heroine, because I think for the first third of the book it's quite difficult to get an actual read on Fanny. I think she's just
she's
quiet.
in the background, isn't she? Very much.
Yeah.
It's interesting as well because Mansfield Park was written, so in order that Jane Austen wrote and published them, it goes Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma. And if you compare Fanny Price to the heroines who came either side of her, Lizzie Bennet and Emma Woodhouse, who are both so gregarious and witty, she's very, very different as a heroine, and she's a very, very different choice of main character.
Yeah, and I liked Fanny. Like, I mean, Fanny is the only likable character in the entire novel. Um,
In a
yeah.
sea of horrible people.
Actually, Mrs. Grant is basically fine as well.
Yeah,
Mrs. Grant and Fanny are allowed, and everyone else is awful.
But in a wonderful way.
Yeah, they're brilliant character sketches, I think. And I don't understand why everyone goes on about Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice, who's a great character, but no one goes on about Mrs. Norris in Mansfield Park, because she's just like a yeah.
Mr. Collins times 500.
Well, she's not though.
Because she's not silly. She's just horrible. She's just awful.
Yeah.
She's just a terrible, horrible human being. But there's so many great characters. Like, I think Lady Bertram and Sir Thomas are really, really good as well. I think the Crawfords are amazing. Like, I think they're two of the most interesting characters in Jane Austen. And they're very interesting for being very complicated characters who definitely aren't good, but also have moments where you think they could be better than they are. And I think it's interesting, a lot of people have talked about before how when you read Mansfield Park, Mary Crawford is much more similar to Jane Austen's other heroines. She is much more similar to Elizabeth Bennet or to Emma Woodhouse than Fanny Price is, in the way that she is witty. She sort of breaks social customs a little bit, but not too much. She's very funny. She sort of has that sparkling wit that Elizabeth Bennet has. But she is cast in a different role in Mansfield Park.
Yeah, I think the Crawfords are really interesting. I think the Crawfords are brilliantly drawn characters. I think the problem I have with the Crawfords is that I think throughout the book we get this increasingly they start as sort of these characters of interest, and then I think relatively quickly it becomes clear that they're, if not the antagonists, they are like the
disruptive force.
They are the disrupt. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the word. They're the disruptive force. They are the engine of conflict in the novel, and they're set up in this way. And then basically, most of the rest of the novel, Jane Austen spends exploring how they're actually more complicated than this. And like, there's some brilliant bits and pieces. Like, there's a bit where Mary Crawford gives Fanny a necklace that turns out to have originally come from Henry Crawford, and she claims that it's just a coincidence, and it's just, and then she later reveals that actually she did know, and it's all a plot to get Fanny to wear something that Henry had originally acquired. And I think that's a great insight into how because it seems a very kind thing to do at the time, and then it becomes much more complicated. But also, like, Mary Crawford seems to be being motivated by like genuine sisterly affection for Henry, and the fact that she does want him to marry Fanny,
and also marry someone who will make him settle down and be better. Like, she does think Fanny could improve Henry,
and she thinks that Henry is a good man ultimately, and would be good for Fanny,
and a good match for Fanny.
And I think, again, with Henry, actually, the plot of Mansfield Park, actually, if you look at Fanny and Henry Crawford, it's not the same plot as Pride and Prejudice, but it's basically, the setup is the same of two people who are quite different, who could grow to respect and care for each other.
Definitely, I think the scenes with Henry Crawford in Portsmouth bear quite a lot of similarity to the scenes with Elizabeth in Derbyshire in Pride and Prejudice. I think they have a lot in common, but of course a very different outcome.
But the problem I have with it is that Jane Austen is normally not reticent about telling us what's going on in our characters' heads.
Yeah.
So, like, for instance, in Pride and Prejudice, we know that Mr. Darcy loves Lizzie for a really long time before that becomes sort of publicly, or at least available to Elizabeth. Like, we know for the whole of her time at Rosings that...
and for quite a lot of the time in Hertfordshire first, that
Mr. Darcy is developing feelings for Lizzie, but it's only with the proposal that Lizzie gets any sense. Whereas, for whatever reason, Jane Austen chooses to present Henry Crawford with virtually no insight into his inner workings, or at least to the extent she does, she says that he is genuinely improving.
Well, it's interesting because the insight we get into Henry is not ever through his thoughts, it's through his conversations with Mary. So we do know things about Henry that Fanny doesn't know, but we still have that like one step removed because it's usually through dialogue, not through his thought.
And I mean, I did know that Fanny was not going to end up with Mr. Crawford before I went into this book. I think probably because I've heard you talk about it before.
Sorry.
But I think I just find the last scene between Fanny and Henry Crawford in Portsmouth doesn't set up what follows. I just don't think it sets up that decision by Henry Crawford to run away with Mrs. Rushworth.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite unsatisfying.
I do think, like, I love Mansfield Park a lot, but I don't think the love story is as satisfying. And I think, in a way, a Mansfield Park in which Fanny Price married Henry Crawford and improved him would be more satisfying. But I think, like, kind of the whole point of Mansfield Park is that she never would do that because she's in love with Edmund, and that her sort of love for Edmund is always going to mean that can never be the case, and because that's sort of established from the beginning, and that's the, like, one of the driving forces of Fanny's life. Like, the two things that drive her always are sort of being in love with Edmund and her moral conscience, basically, and both those things go against Henry, and even when she gets to know Henry a bit more and maybe is less morally opposed to him, there's still that thing between them that is Edmund, and that's why she can never marry him, which I think means, yes, maybe the book is not as, like, romantic and not as a great love story, but also that's quite powerful as well.
So I think the problem I have, though, is that Henry Crawford is snapped right back into, like, the villain role right at the end, and that's not actually the Henry Crawford we've seen for most of the book. So I think you were talking about the two sort of motivating factors of Fanny Price being, like, her moral certainty that Henry Crawford is not the right man to marry and her love for Edmund. But I think the problem with that is it doesn't quite work in the way that Jane Austen structured the plot, because the Portsmouth scenes, basically Fanny abandons her moral certainty that Henry Crawford, like, she basically thinks, actually, if it wasn't for the fact that I loved Edmund, I could marry you. Which is really interesting, because obviously she's right that he's the wrong person to marry, as he proves that, you know, even though I think the reader is convinced even earlier than Fanny is. And it's interesting that the reader's actually basically, I think probably against Fanny as well for some of the book. It's really interesting that Jane Austen decided to basically have everyone, including the reader, against Fanny, and Fanny stick to her conviction. And I think that would work really well if it isn't for the fact that Fanny abandons her conviction right at the moment when she should stick to it. And I think the other problem I have is that basically then that leaves her love for Edmund. And I find Edmund about as uncompelling as a romantic figure as it is possible to come across. Edmund just proves himself unworthy of Fanny in every respect.
Yeah.
Like, he completely lacks moral fibre. He's completely oblivious to Fanny's feelings, and, like, he's willing to throw her over, even though, like, he keeps on saying that she's, like, the most dear to him, other than maybe Miss Crawford. Like, he's willing to throw her over for Miss Crawford, basically, repeatedly.
But I do think it's important that Fanny Price's sort of first impressions of Henry Crawford are proved right, and that she's sort of proved right for not wanting to marry him despite anything, and she is sort of validated and vindicated, I think, by what happened. Edmund is definitely not the most exciting Jane Austen love interest. I think he's one of the weakest. He's definitely not my favourite at all. But I also think, like, the fact that he is quite, like, quiet and a bit dull probably suits Fanny quite well. And I also think, like, in the same way that she could improve Henry Crawford, I think she can probably improve Edmund in his slightly lacking a backbone at some times.
All the time.
All the time. And, you know, I think you can see that they are quite well suited in some ways, and definitely better suited, I think, than Fanny and Henry Crawford, much as that is a more, like, romantic pair in a way. And I think the sort of companionship and friendship between them, Jane Austen sort of praises. But yes, I don't think he is the most exciting. I don't love Edmund that much, and I sort of feel like I love Mansfield Park not for the love story, but for everything else that's going on in it.
Yeah, I think Jane Austen does praise, like, the friendship, but like I say, there's the bit at the very beginning of the book where, like, Fanny is distraught and Edmund is the one that comforts her.
Yeah.
I think it's really lovely. It's a
but
really...
like, I like the bit where he brings her a chain for the necklace that William, her brother's given to her, and also, like, the bit where they're standing at the window and talking about how they used to, like, go stargazing and stuff. Like, I think there are nice moments between them.
I think, yeah, there's some lovely moments, and I think they have a lovely, lovely friendship. But I think what I find difficult is that Edmund proves over and over again that he's not willing to prioritise that friendship.
Yeah.
And I just don't think he actually deserves to end up with Fanny, like, to be honest.
Yeah.
The stuff with the play,
Yeah.
like, he has identified that, at least in terms of the morality of the novel, it is unacceptable for these young people to be putting on a play. And he's identified that it's wrong and that it should not be done, and that he's willing to basically throw away his own convictions.
Yeah.
I think the other thing I found a bit dissatisfying is that the things that Jane Austen criticises the characters, like particularly at the end when it's talking about I think it actually talks about punishment in terms of Mrs. Norris, but like I think throughout the book it's made clear that the narrator does not approve of the way that Mrs. Norris treats Fanny, which is horrible. Like, she's a really nasty woman.
She is awful.
And she's a brilliantly drawn character, like absolutely fantastic. I think they're all brilliantly drawn. But at the end, it singles out Mrs. Norris's great sin as being overindulging Maria and Julia, and not being cruel to Fanny. And obviously, like, being cruel to Fanny is kind of an adjunct to that, but it's interesting that it doesn't single out what I think is the worst thing about Mrs. Norris.
But I think it sort of is there implicitly throughout. And I also feel like her behaviour to Maria affected Maria terribly. But Fanny is strong enough in herself that actually Mrs. Norris didn't break her.
Maria is a very interesting character, actually. I think another thing I find a bit disappointing is that Maria has a really interesting story, and we only see the first half of it.
Yeah.
Like...
It's true, there is another... I'm sure there's a good Jane Austen retelling in that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear the story of Mrs. Rushworth. And I don't think we need to see all of it, but it's just Mrs. Rushworth, basically. She never features in the book as Mrs. Rushworth, nearly. She just gets married and then she's off, and then at the end she causes problems for everyone.
Yeah.
But and then, like, Dr. Grant's punished for eating too much by apoplexy and death.
That does seem...
Which just seems a bit extreme. Like,
well, I guess there's quite a lot about, like, overindulgence in Mansfield Park. That's a big theme, I think, like, excess. In the way people treat each other, but also sort of Julia and Maria, who are very spoilt, and Dr. Grant, who eats so much, sort of Lady Bertram, who is so indolent. There's a lot of characters who are pushed to extremes and who are very, very excessive. And then sort of the few characters who are a bit more moderate, people like Fanny and Edmund, are sort of praised and held up for that in comparison to the excessive other characters, people who don't do things by halves, really.
yeah, I think Lady Bertram gets off quite lightly in the end as well, actually, because like it singles out Mrs. Norris for like criticism for basically being a surrogate parent who overindulges her children, and then it criticises Sir Thomas for being too strict with his children and basically making them afraid of him.
Yeah, so that he never really knows what they're truly like.
But then Lady Bertram takes no interest in her children.
Yeah, she's a very, very indifferent parent, and both to her own children and sort of as a parent figure to Fanny. I do think she's a really interesting character because she's one of those parent figures in Jane Austen who sort of she means well somewhere, but she just doesn't care enough or know what she's doing enough to do anything, so that she likes Fanny. You know, when there's a chance that Fanny might marry Henry Crawford, she's like, oh, I'll give you some puppies when Pug has a litter, which as far as she's concerned is like the greatest gift. But that's how weird her ideas are, and that's how skewed they are, and she basically just sits about and plays with her dog and does nothing else.
And I like Lady Bertram more than Mrs. Norris.
Yes, obviously.
And like I think that's what I find interesting, is that the implication is that Lady Bertram's less criticised because she was at least nice to Fanny, even in a not very effective way.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's actually drawn out at the end, which I find quite interesting.
Yeah. Though I guess in a way, like, the bad fate of quite a lot of their children is a punishment in a way for both Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram, as well as Mrs. Norris.
So I agree, but I think it's interesting what Jane Austen chooses to explicitly draw out and what she just chooses to leave as implicit in the book.
Yeah.
The other thing I found a little bit uncomfortable was the prices, because basically the prices are quite heavily criticised in the book.
Yeah.
And I feel like really the price's sin is not having as much money as the Bertrams.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is basically said that Mrs. Price would be perfectly fine had she been Lady Bertram. No one would have ever noticed that she was terrible at being a housekeeper, basically. But in her own life, she really, really struggles because she doesn't have enough money. And she is judged for that, I think, to a certain extent. Not as much, I think, as Mr. Price is. I think Mr. Price is more heavily criticised. Mrs. Price, at least, like, at first tries to take an interest in Fanny, even though really she doesn't really care much about her daughters. She cares much more about her sons.
Like, the impression that is given is kind of squalor in the Prices.
Yeah.
But, like, actually,
They've
the Prices...
got a few servants.
The Prices are a middle-class family who
yeah.
keep 2 servants. These aren't people with the same kind of wherewithal as the Bertrams, but, like...
No, they're not.
They're not, like, vagabonds or living
yeah.
on the street. And,
Yeah.
like, it's just... I think it's interesting that the proper glimpse, like I said before, it's interesting to see a proper glimpse of the middle class. But It's such contempt.
I also think there is a huge contempt for aristocrats in Mansfield Park as well. Like, I think Sir Thomas and Lady Bertram are very badly criticised.
I agree, but I think the criticisms of them are individual to their characters, and I think
maybe.
the criticism of the Prices, although obviously their characters are drawn in a particular way,
Yeah.
I think it's much harder to separate their economic status from their failings.
I'm not sure about that. I think it's more to do with their individual characters. I think there is that comment saying that Mrs. Price would have been better placed in Lady Bertram's place, or less people would have noticed her failings, basically. But Lady Bertram is not without failings. They're in fact very, very similar. And I think it's more her character isn't equal to the struggles that she has to go through. But whereas Fanny's probably would be. I think the other interesting similarity to draw between Mrs. Norris and Mrs. Price, rather than Lady Bertram, is their obsession with servants. So this is something John Mullen talks about in What Matters in Jane Austen, that in general the characters in Jane Austen who talk the most about their servants are the nasty characters who basically just spend a lot of time criticising their servants, or, as Mrs. Norris is, trying to be over-considerate of servants in a really patronising way. And I think you can see some similarity between Mrs. Norris and Mrs. Price there as well.
Well, I mean, really, you could read Mansfield Park as effectively, because it starts with the three sisters.
Yeah, yeah.
And you can read it really as an analysis of the three sisters,
Yeah.
all of whom are deeply flawed people,
Yeah.
and all of whom, but actually you could read Mansfield Park as a morality tale,
in
which all three sisters get their comeuppance in one way or another.
Yeah, and also what sort of traits get passed on to the next generation. And in a way, I think because the aristocratic family and the middle class family are so heavily criticised, Fanny Price, who is middle class but had the education of aristocratic families, is sort of somewhere in the middle and is praised. And I think you can certainly see in other Jane Austen novels it is the gentry rather than the aristocrats that Jane Austen thinks are better, and that aristocrats are sort of criticised a lot for being excessive, spending too much money, and not being very nice people, in a way that the gentry aren't quite.
I mean, I think it's fascinating actually talking about there's always exceeding your income and stuff, and it's fascinating because obviously for Jane Austen and people at the time, the problem was excess. But actually, really what's going on is there's some significant structural shifts in the English economy, and actually owning the land is no longer the most profitable thing that you can do.
And I suppose as well, we know that Sir Thomas Bertram's fortune is in part built on the slave trade. And I don't think it's precisely clear when Mansfield Park is set. I think the implication is it's set a little bit before it's written. But certainly that wealth is not going to last forever.
So Sir Thomas's wealth comes from owning slaves, or at least part of it. It's not clear, but the fact that he spends so much time in the
Antigua,
on his plantations, suggests it is a significant part of his income,
and also a significant part of his income that is under strain at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously there's almost no references to the outside world in Pride and Prejudice. And I think one of the things we talked about when we talked about Pride and Prejudice last year was how interesting there's basically no mention of the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah,
there's
so
lots of
many soldiers and no war.
It's interesting to have a reference to the outside world.
But I guess again there's sort of lots of references to it, but not much exploration. There have been quite a lot of readings that people have done claiming that Mansfield Park is all about the slave trade, which I do not think is necessarily that justified from the few mentions there are. It's an absence, and it's an interesting absence, and I think it's a significant absence in Mansfield Park. But although that is where Sir Thomas Bertram's wealth comes from, it's not dealt with that much.
Well, I think there is only one reference
actually to the slave trade.
When Edmund says that Fanny's quiet with Sir Thomas, Fanny says that she asked him a question about the slave trade.
But we don't know what question she asked.
We don't know what question it was. Sir Thomas's trip to the plantation I found really interesting as well, because again, there's another bit about the narrative that's a bit weird. It's Sir Thomas is going on a long and dangerous journey. I hope nothing bad happens to Sir Thomas. It'd be really awful if something bad happened to Sir Thomas. And then nothing bad happens to Sir Thomas.
No, it's true.
And again, I feel I think it was more justified at the end, but when it's oh no, Tom Bertram's ill. I hope nothing bad happens to Tom Bertram, and then Edmund becomes the heir to the estate, and that wouldn't that be such an awful, lovely, neat, awful, wonderful way to tie it up? And I think it's really good that it doesn't.
Yeah.
And obviously that serves the function of kind of revealing Miss Crawford's true
Yeah,
colours.
yeah, exactly.
I think it really quite strongly foreshadows that something bad is going to happen to Sir Thomas.
Yeah.
And then nothing bad happens to
No,
Sir
that's
Thomas,
true.
which it does.
Yeah,
it
I've never
threw me a
really
bit,
thought of that,
actually.
to be honest. I just always think of it as him sort of needing to be absent so that all the young people can run wild, basically.
Yeah, I think I found it as well, like, the theatre and stuff, it's just hard to take seriously, like everyone, like the moral panic about young people putting on a play.
I think it's one of the reasons why Mansfield Park is so many people's least favourite, is because I think it is the hardest Austen to understand without its social and historical context. Like, unless you get how immoral it is that they're doing this, it's really hard. And I haven't read Lovers' Vows. I quite like to. I know a couple of other booktubers.
Oh, it's a real play?
Yeah, it's a real play. And I know a couple of booktubers, Tilly from Tilly Shelf and Ros from Scally Dabbling, about the book. They're reading it this year. And I would quite like to read it. I might try and read it next year and reread Mansfield Park, because I'd be interested to see how scandalous it is as a play, and whether that would add extra context, and whether a lot of people in the time reading Mansfield Park would have known the play and would have known that this was quite raunchy for this time or whatever.
I could understand on like an intellectual level that they were being transgressive, but I think it loses some of the emotional impact when the way they're being transgressive is to do something that's
Amateur dramatics.
It's complete, amateur dramatics, basically. So we now think to be quite a long way on the safe end of like young people's
behaviour,
indulgences.
yeah.
Like if your teenage child announces that they've developed a passion for amateur dramatics, you'd probably be quite relieved, I think.
But I find that so interesting. Like, that's one of the reasons why I love Mansfield Park, because it's fascinating that that is such a big issue in this book, and that is so immoral, and that is so bad that they want to put on a theatre show, is this kind of huge lack of propriety. And one of the reasons why I find Mansfield Park so interesting is because I think the exploration of sort of propriety and morality and what's okay and what's not okay to do is so interesting.
Like, really, the book is about morality.
Yeah,
and like,
yeah.
Fanny is the only character, really, in the entire book who is tested and succeeds. Fanny is the only character with flawless morals and a flawless adherence to those morals. The centre point of Mansfield Park is like, Fanny is immovable in her morals. And I think that's why I have a problem with the Portsmouth scene, because it slightly undercuts that. Not massively, but I think it does undercut it a bit. But equally, Edmund has the same moral compass as Fanny, and fails, and he's just not worthy to be with Fanny. Like, that's the problem, is by the standard of the book, Edmund should be in the punishment camp and not in the happily ever after camp.
But Fanny loves him, so he gets a happy ending because it's her happy ending. Like, I do think that, and I do, like I've said before, I don't think it's the most satisfying love story. Fanny Price loves Edmund for the whole book, and that's important. And that love is unshakable, and that love means she can forgive the flaws he does have, and that she can hopefully make him better, is important. I don't think he quite deserves Mary Crawford, but...
Mary Crawford's interesting because I think there is some... We are supposed to be like, ooh, I don't really like her, and then we're like, oh, no, she's quite... Well, she's funny, and like, actually...
Yeah,
I think
she's a fun character.
I think both the Crawfords, it's interesting that Jane Austen, much more so than I think in Pride and Prejudice, where I think, like, for instance, Wickham, who's probably the closest analogue to Henry Crawford.
In terms of that rake figure, that's who the role they both occupy. I think by the end of Pride and Prejudice, we are firmly convinced that Wickham is just evil. Whereas I don't think by the end of Mansfield Park, you believe that Henry Crawford is all evil.
No, or Miss Crawford.
Or Miss Crawford, yeah. If we take Miss Crawford as equivalent of Caroline Bingley, she fulfills that role to a certain extent, but she is definitely not that role.
No.
She's a very, very different person, and she's much more complex, and she's much more nuanced, and she's much more likeable.
Yeah, and I think
that's so interesting.
Jane Austen does a really good job of like varying, like you have the necklace, like I talked about, and then you have it was a plan, and then there's all sorts of bits and pieces where she's nice to Fanny, and like we see it in her head, and actually she does care about Fanny, or at least we are told by the narrator that she does.
And she does care about Edmund. Like, she knows from the beginning that the sensible, practical thing for her to do is to fall in love, or make herself fall in love with Tom Bertram, because he's going to he's the elder son. But she doesn't, because she likes Edmund much more.
But I think the problem I have is that last letter she writes,
where she says, well, if Tom dies,
I was like,
the best person.
I was like, whoa, slow down there, Miss Crawford. That's and I feel like that's a real like screeching, a bit like Henry Crawford is. They just both at the end do a bit of a screeching U-turn And then suddenly it's like, oh, good, evil, good, evil, good, evil, good, evil, good, evil, evil.
I do think so. I think there's two things. One, I think like it is supposed to be this moment of like she lets down her guard to Fanny because she is hoping that Edmund will become Sir Thomas, or not Sir Thomas, obviously, become Sir Edmund, because that would help her future. So I think there is that. I also think that would be considered awful, but I think that would be considered a slightly less awful thing to say in the Regency period, because I think in general people were a bit more candid about death. So I do feel like...
But I mean, it is considered awful though. Like,
Fanny does consider it awful. It is awful, but I think it is incredibly shocking for a modern reader, and I think it would have been a tiny bit less so at this time.
It's interesting in terms of Miss Crawford in particular, is like, she's really critical of the clergy. And I suppose in some respects Edmund's supposed to be like the right kind of clergyman. Even though, actually maybe a clergyman with a moral spine would be better, but like, I think it's interesting that he's chosen a profession where he doesn't have to do anything, he just has to tell other people what the right thing to do is, which I think Edmund would be quite good at, actually, to be honest. I think the book is really quite critical of clergymen. Like, if you think...
Yeah, of Dr. Grant, certainly.
Well, Dr. Grant is, and Edmund at the end when he takes orders, are the only actual clergymen in the book.
Yeah.
And Edmund is morally spineless, and Dr. Grant just eats. And I think there's a real, like, criticism of... like the clergy and like their sort of indulgence. And it's really interesting because that is really a symptom of like people like Sir Thomas just putting younger sons into livings. And it's a real problem at this time. Like actually quite a lot of like the church in the late 18th century is pretty like corrupt. I think there's so much criticism of it, but a lot of it comes from Mary Crawford. But I feel like it also comes from Jane Austen. Like, I think, and it's interesting that Jane Austen chose to put things that I think she was probably suggesting were correct into the mouth of a character who is supposed to be like one of the negative forces in the book.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that like in all of Jane Austen, there are quite a lot of good, nice clergymen and quite a lot of awful, awful clergymen, and not much in between. And I think there's definitely a criticism of the reasons that people go into the church in Jane Austen, and people going into it for like a comfy living, basically, and not for any religious reason is definitely criticised.
I think that's right. Other than Susan's quite interesting, even though she's very briefly in it.
Susan and William.
Yeah, I think, well, William's interesting because obviously he's quite a significant character in that he looms large for Fanny.
Yeah.
And I think part of his role is to remind you that she's not actually a sibling of the family. So it doesn't feel quite as incestuous when she lets
she has
Edmund,
a brother, and she has a very different relationship with her actual brother to her surrogate siblings, one of whom she wants to marry.
Well, I think that is actually genuinely part of the role he plays.
I do think so too. Yeah.
Because he doesn't actually do anything else. Like,
he is important to the plot as well in terms of Mr. Crawford helping him get made in the Navy.
But you could replace that with anything.
Yeah,
like...
I think he's also important in the plot for when he comes to Mansfield and we see how different Fanny is, how much less like emotionally oppressed and how much like chattier she is with him because she feels comfortable with him. And I think that is quite important in terms of building Fanny's character and also in terms of how Mr. Crawford perceives Fanny's character, because he sees her with her brother and is like, oh, she's not as quiet and emotionless as I thought her.
That's interesting.
Which is important too.
And, well, he's also like, this is what I think is interesting, is that Henry Crawford actually correctly identifies that the thing that Fanny cares about most is her brother, correctly identifies that everyone else in Mansfield neglects Fanny. And actually, like, when Henry Crawford is wooing Fanny, he's actually quite nice to her. Like, and he actually is one of the only characters who seems to really appreciate her work.
Which I do like him for. I think that's quite...
Actually, he has a much better sense of, other than the fact that the chain that Edmund gives her, which is the right one, like, Henry Crawford has a much better sense of what Fanny wants than Edmund does, which I think is really interesting. William is the most important character who has nothing to do, if that makes sense.
And he wasn't in it very much, considering his importance, I
think all the other characters are sort of implicit. Like, William, you could cut William, and you'd lose something, but not a lot. Whereas cutting any of the other characters, the threads get so tangled so quickly that it'd be quite difficult. And then Susan is interesting because, again, it's like, not all of the middle class are awful. Some of them can be redeemed by education and being made to be a slave to Lady Bertram. But actually, that is the role she's like, because obviously she's set up.
Going to be there to replace Fanny, so that Lady Bertram still has someone to tell what to do.
I actually really liked that bit in Southampton where it's like actually Fanny's kind of feeling more confident, and also like, you know, she subscribes to like, she's like, oh, I'm someone who subscribes to a library, and like I'm the wealthy benefactor.
And also I can help here because I have I have the education that my siblings lacked, but I can try and do something for them.
And I think like it's really interesting to see that change in Fanny as she sees herself as like an agent rather than a passive observer. And like she identifies Susan as as the one who needs to be saved because everyone else can't be saved. But it's like that one's got some potential. I'm going to take her with me. And it is interesting that when she's thinking about marrying Henry Crawford, one of the things she does think is that she could take Susan into her household, basically. In a way that I think is quite nice. But then I think at the end of the book, basically, Susan best replaces Fanny as Lady Bertram's slave so Fanny can marry her cousin.
But Mrs. Norris isn't there now, so I think Susan will have a better life.
Yeah, I think the implication is that she's not going to be miserable, but equally, her role is to just do what Lady Bertram wants. So, those were our thoughts on Mansfield Park.
So, you like Pride and Prejudice more. How do you consider Mansfield Park in relation to Lady Susan? Obviously, they're very different. Lady
Susan is a more complete plot. Mansfield Park is a more interesting book, I think is what I'd say. I really like Mansfield Park. I think I'd say it's got slightly better characters than Pride and Prejudice. I think Pride and Prejudice, when I read that, even though I knew the story, and I read the story, I was like, I can see why this is so many people's favourite book, and I can see why people read this book over and over again. I would read Mansfield Park again, and I think I would find it interesting, but I'm not sure I'd find it as delightful as Pride and Prejudice. I think it's got brilliant characters. There's some brilliant character sketches, but I think the plot, ultimately, it is, like you said, it's a book about morality, and I don't think it can quite decide what the key moral issues are. I think where it comes down on certain things is a bit surprising. And it is a book all about morality that comes down basically at the end with a black and white yes or no, but has spent the book building up a really nuanced portrait of all these characters. But I
sort of feel that in itself is like a criticism of early 19th century society.
I think I really enjoyed the bit where it's Mariah's ruined and she has to go and live abroad, and she'll with Mrs. Norris, or even worse than living abroad is living abroad with Mrs. Norris.
Mr. Crawford, that's fine.
Well, it's like Mr. Crawford was disgraced for a while, and then it was fine, and then the narrator is literally like, "Do we think this is right?" Which I quite enjoyed, but I think it's a really interesting book that doesn't quite tie everything together. I think
it's great.
Worth a read.
Worth many a read. Okay, I think that's probably enough of us rambling for today. So thank you very much for watching. Let us know down in the comments what you think of Mansfield Park, and that's all. I'll be back very soon with another bookish video. I'm glad you liked it. And it's okay that you just did. You literally, you just did. I have it on video.